Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. This episode will be a continuation of the last video where we'll be looking closer at the HBCUs. So right here we're looking at an article about the history of the HBCUs. It says HBCUs mission rooted in Reconstruction. The American Civil War, often called the War Between the States, had barely ended before a passionate new battle for hearts and minds began. It was 1866. The issue facing those trying to reunite the nation was how to help some 4 million blacks in the South transition from slavery to freedom. Today, higher education looks at a key chapter in its evolution in the United States as the nation's historically black colleges across the South trace their roots to people and politics of those three key 1866 to 1868 post-Civil War Reconstruction years. So let me pause for a second and go say that Andrew Johnson, the 17th president of the United States, was in office from April of 1865 till March of 1869. So roughly 4 years in office, specifically the years that these HBCUs were being established. So back here it says the sesquicentennial celebrations began last month at Fisk University. Another celebration is expected this time next year as Howard University will mark its founding in 1867. Several more institutions, including Hampton University, founded in 1868, are likely to do the same. So basically, those are rituals. They'll have reenactments and everything at those so-called celebrations. It says, exploring the roots of historically black colleges helps to better explain the challenges and achievements of the pioneers and put today's hurdles in context, says historians. The idea of an instantly reunited America with almost 4 million new citizens becoming full participants in American society had not escaped the thinking of the people and leaders of the North and South. To the aid of the former slaves, the one-time contraband people, and the now freedmen, came Northern evangelical abolitionists, as the United Church of Christ calls them in its historical documents. The missionaries, as they were known, were mostly whites and a few blacks who felt that the institution of slavery had robbed black people of dignity and morals, historians say. Many had done missionary work abroad. They wanted to bring their moral values to the South. Formal education would be a great vehicle for doing so, they felt, according to historical accounts. Congress, meanwhile, created the Bureau of Refugees, freedmen, and abandoned lands. In early 1865 to help for 1 year in the Reconstruction of the South. Working as a unit of the Department of War, the Freedmen's Bureau could set up education programs, allocate land the federal government had claimed as abandoned during the war, and help to establish labor agreements. To help manage the transition, President Andrew Johnson brought in a team of military generals who served in the Union Army. They were abolitionist leaning, historians write, and all were devoutly religious, they note. So to help, Andrew Johnson brought in these military generals. So that's the point of this. The whole thing came from Andrew Johnson bringing in these generals. Down here it says the Union generals working through the Freedmen's Bureau could provide the land and some government funds for education programs. So these generals provided the land for the schools. Now, what were the land? They were the plantations. But it says to help manage the transition, President Johnson brought in a team of military generals. Now, why would Andrew Johnson want to help? We got to go look at his attitude and his relationship with these the people they calling black on here. So right here, I'm going to be reading from the book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, where it talks about Andrew Johnson being the only U.S. president that was born a slave. It says, one remarkable former member of the poor white trash of the South who exhibited a lifelong solidarity with his own kind. Now, he was born a slave, so his own kind were the slaves at the plantations. Says he was the phenomenally successful Andrew Johnson, military governor of Tennessee, which means he was a head of the white militia at the plantation or the forts. U.S. Senator, Vice President, and 17th President of the United States. It says a prevailing myth has it that Lincoln was assassinated because hidden powers knew he would be lenient to the South during Reconstruction. This view is exploded when one studies the background and views of his successor to the presidency, which was Andrew Johnson, who was everything to the defeated Southern people, which were the white slaves, though not to their planter-dominated Confederate leadership, who he generally despised. That would have been the Aboriginal people, that the myth makers claim Lincoln would have been. President Johnson was impeached mainly through the partisan efforts of politicians such as Rep. Thaddeus Stevens and Senator Charles Sumner, precisely because Johnson refused to cooperate in the collective Reconstruction punishment of poor white people in the South. That's a lie they telling right there. Andrew Johnson was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, where at the age of 10, he was apprenticed to the Selby tailor shop in order to work 12 hours a day until he was 21 years of age. Andrew could hardly miss feeling the striking contrast between himself and the white elite, the aristocrats. When Andrew and his cousins once ran across the path between the house of John Devereux and that of his son, Devereux sent his coachman to whip the boys back to their shanty. The whip was habitually used on those the Devereux called poor white trash. So who was the coachman? The coachman was an Aboriginal. They were the police paid to police the poor white trash or the white slaves, which in this case right here would have been Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson used to get whipped by Aboriginals when he was a slave as a kid. After enduring nearly 6 years of apprenticeship, Johnson fled Raleigh. A $10 reward was posted for his capture. So he had Aboriginals looking for him because when there was a reward, they was out there head hunting to go get it. So he was running from Aboriginal peoples trying to put him back on the plantation. It says by law, no other employer in North Carolina was allowed to give him work. As long as he remained in North Carolina, he was subject to arrest and in danger of capture. Johnson fled to Tennessee, where he went into business for himself and eventually became a leader of men. So he became a leader of the white slaves, sort of like Nathaniel Bacon. Johnson has been described as having strongly held predilections for the white laboring classes and deepest prejudice against the blacks. As military governor of Tennessee during the war, Johnson protected the white poor. Johnson was a staunch Unionist, strictly devoted to preserving the country as one nation. That means that they wanted to take over all the Aboriginal towns and what they owned and make it all the United States. That's what that means. It doesn't mean that they were trying to separate. If you go look at the counties in Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, the parishes in Louisiana, the counties in Texas, Arkansas, and Tennessee, you'll see that most of that area was created and developed after the Civil War. So that's what he means by Johnson was a staunch Unionist, strictly devoted to preserving the country as one nation. Lincoln selected him as his vice president in 1864 because Johnson was a border state Southerner, a constituency which was Lincoln's crucial power base and one he sought to fortify with Johnson. So because Johnson became the leader of the Southern militias, basically, and the poor whites on the plantations, Lincoln used that to his benefit. That Lincoln and Johnson held very different views on racial matters was evident when Lincoln introduced Johnson to a black leader at the inauguration. Frederick Douglass recalled that when Lincoln pointed him out to Johnson prior to the ceremonies, the vice president responded at first with a bitter expression of contempt. Douglass concluded right then and there that the Tennessean was no friend of the black race. So Andrew Johnson, he grew up as a slave being whipped by Aboriginals. So at the first sight of Frederick Douglass, he had a bitter expression of contempt on his face. So understand that right there. That slave upbringing scarred him for life. It goes on to say, perhaps Johnson had read Douglass's book, Life and Times, which denounced the poor white people of Maryland as being of the lowest order. As president, Johnson ordered the removal of Negro troops from East Tennessee and Mississippi. He also reanimated white Southern resistance and fatally undermined efforts to integrate the Negro freedmen into society. Now, he did all this, but he also helped create the HBCUs. You understand this? According to the Cincinnati Enquirer, Johnson wrote to Governor Thomas C. Fletcher of Missouri, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." In 1859, while U.S. Senator Johnson asserted that the famous, now it says U.S. Senator Johnson in 1859, but that means he was a senator of the forts. Understand, they hadn't left the forts until after the Civil War, when the so-called Reconstruction, when they put the Aboriginals on their plantations or their forts and then took over the towns and cities. Understand what that means. When he says that U.S. Senator Johnson in 1859, he was on a fort, a plantation with a bunch of other Europeans. Says that in 1859, while U.S. Senator Johnson asserted that the famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence proclaiming that all men were created equal could not apply to Negroes. The 17th president unquestionably undermined the Reconstruction process. What defeated him during his term in the White House was not so much his lack of formal education, nor even his tactlessness, but his failure to outgrow his Jefferson Jacksonian background. Johnson's continued identification with an America of small farmers and mechanics, which were the slaves, the yeomen, his attachment to a strict construction of the Constitution that was no longer in vogue, his refusal to adjust his racial views to the needs of the Republican Party, and his persistent belief in the agrarian myth blinded him to the realities of the post-Civil War U.S. Considering the effect of his policies upon the South, he had achieved, at least in the long run, what he wanted: the continued existence of viable Southern state governments within the Union and the maintenance of white supremacy. President Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. To protest, the Convention of Colored Men met in Washington and chose a delegation to take their grievances directly to the president. Both Frederick Douglass and his son Lewis were members of the delegation. Douglass, as chief spokesman, said that black people should be given the vote with which to save ourselves. Johnson, once an indigent servant learning the craft of tailoring with repressed anger, declared, moving very near to Mr. Douglass, that poor whites and blacks had always been bitter enemies, and if they were thrown together at the ballot box, a race war would ensue. Johnson told them black people should immigrate. He would have been delighted to load the first ship with the delegation he was addressing. Radical Republican Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner also personally interceded with President Johnson to demand the vote for Negroes. After meeting with Johnson, Sumner wrote, much that he said was painful from its prejudice and perversity. President Johnson was so contemptuous of the Negrophile senator that in the course of their discussion, he used the senator's hat as a spittoon. So he grabbed a man's hat and spit in it, right? He was determined to frustrate congressional reconstruction and protect Southern whites from what he considered the horrors of full racial equality. But he helped build the HBCUs, right, on the plantations that he grew up in and experienced. Through the history books, which has all been a lie. So therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie, then what's the truth?